Hi, you're with Julian on the Brown Note. For once, appropriately smoking and drinking wine. I feel like that's part of the culture associated with the album I'm about to review, which is Lives Outgrown by Beth Gibbons. Beth Gibbons is alongside perhaps Kate Bush, Liz Fraser of the Cocteau Twins, as one of the most iconic alternative British voices of the last 30 or 40 years. Of course, most notably with the band, the three-piece that she has recorded 3 albums with, called Portishead, where Dummy was a defining artifact alongside Maxine K by Tricky and Blue Lines by Massive Attack in founding an entire musical world called, for better or worse, trip hop. Her voice, her torch song, brittle, deeply pained, despairing voice was a defining characteristic of that album Dummy and the subsequent albums by Portishead. The second album was fantastic, and then there was the unexpected album called Third, which came out, and I watched Portishead play live in Australia at the Harvest Festival, and it was one of those gigs you'll never forget. I don't think I've been to a gig where people were more silent. Everything was just watched with such reverence. It was an amazing night. And since then they've been quiet. I mean, Jeff Barlow, one of the 3 from Portishead, continually releases music with collaborative projects, with doing soundtrack work. But Beth Gibbons hasn't, although I did find out that she had released an album with members of Talk Talk, which I feel very ashamed to not have heard about before, because I love Laughingstock and Spirit of Eden so much. The idea of having her voice on that is, how did I not know that had happened? So this is her debut album of sorts. It's her first album under her own name, and I believe it features members of that Talk Talk collective, obviously not the sadly deceased Mark Hollis, but I think it does actually feature musicianship throughout from members of Talk Talk. Now, the album itself is quite something. It is the most miserable listen. It is the most depressing album in history. It is a dark, dark world that we're about to enter. The opening track, Tell Me Who You Are Today, it's sort of got initially a bit of a Nick Drake vibe, but that warm, woolly Nick Drake vibe dissipates very, very quickly. It's just sort of like the instrumentation reminded me a little bit of Nick Drake, who himself could be pretty bleak. It's a very consistent album soundstage wise, and one of the more continual musical motifs is the use of toms, but very sort of cavernous toms, almost like they're in the distance, and they're like war drums that are on most of the tracks. I think it's a very, very classy album, and Beth she sounds really edgy and desperate on a lot of this album, almost as a musical touch point, eerie like Pyramid Song by Radiohead. Acoustic guitars are used really well throughout this album. Same on the second track, Floating on a Moment, which is immediately a highlight of the album. The opening track is just merely good, but then we go into a run of very, very strong tracks. The riff it reminded me of the Chili Peppers. It's got this like acoustic sort of riff going on, and it reminded me of a Californication era sort of Chili Peppers song, Floating on a Moment, don't know how long, as Too Afraid to Be Free. The lyrics are never that chirpy. It's not a chuckle fest. Lots of existentialism, looks at mortality. Sufjan Stevens style children's choirs I really liked here as well, not with the same warmth that he brought to Will Anybody Ever Love Me, but very nice sounding. A lovely chorus. Are we going to nowhere? It's a miserablest affair, which only gets even worse with track 3, The Burden of Life. The burden of life just won't leave us alone. Christ. The chorus is gorgeous, and the music starts getting more experimental. Instead of just being these sort of acoustic folk palettes, there's a lot of thought gone into the instrumentation and arrangements on this album. And I think I reviewed an album recently, maybe the Amon Dunes album, where I thought when they did introduce experimental elements, it really lifted everything, but they just didn't do it enough on that album. And I gave it a bad review, but they do it plenty here, but still in a restrained and classy manner. She is just class. The track 4, Love, changes about how you can be in love with somebody, but over time that becomes less passionate and more mundane and ordinary, and longing for that to come back. Again, another chuckle fest. Begins with this really interesting Hey Kids Over There, which made me think of the REM track Drive from Automatic for the People, itself a riff on a David Essex song. And it does have that death poetry feel of that incredible track from REM across the album. And it did remind me a little bit of the last few Nick Cave albums, where he's really focused on mortality and death and despair. God knows. It's just such exquisite misery, though. It really is. Rewind is probably the most, out of the tracks that we've encountered so far, is the most driving. It's the first one that seems to have actual rock percussion, like proper drums and maybe even snares and electric guitar. Who knew that those things existed in this world? And another element that I thought I recognised on this was almost like the kind of feel and vibe of the violins from the Led Zeppelin song Kashmir, which I felt like in between Pyramid Song by Radiohead and Kashmir by Led Zeppelin. It's almost like this woozy, soaring violins, and some nice the percussive breaks as well, get into sort of free jazz, and the notion of the song being that you can't go backwards in time. And again, it's not like you can't go back, so let's enjoy life. It's like, oh no, I've wasted my whole life and I can't go back and do anything again. Following on from that sort of percussive lead, Reaching Out, another massively strong track, kind of getting into the same sort of vibe I felt where Tom Waits sort of got into with the Rain Dogs, Swordfish Trombones era. Her voice throughout this album is fantastic. Her vocal performances are amazing, and frequently very despairing. So, honestly, Reaching Out it could be like a sort of like a very dark pop song, kind of, and the chorus gets quite furious on this. We sort of come back down with Oceans, which is a very plaintive track compared to the two previous ones, but actually the most beautiful chorus, maybe the prettiest chorus on the whole album. My heart is tired and worn. For Sale, winding into a very happy end towards this album. Smiling with White Teeth, Taste of Ammonia, Lost of Dreams. It's just constantly bouncing between despair and resignation. Beyond the Sun, it sounded almost like Vashti Bunyan, the early 70s folk legend of very sort of pastoral farmland folk music, who became incredibly trendy in the 2000s, had a very bad day. Not a diamond day, but a very bad day. It's got lovely verse melodies, and the toms come back and are very driving. One of the most propulsive tracks, I think, the penultimate track, and the atonal guitars again. The sonic palette really does expand throughout the album, and there are actual snares on this track, and it's pleasingly noisy as well. And then we go into the longest track, I think, Whispering Love, which is beautiful. Opens with this really mournful flute, and this nice sort of background motif that soars. I don't know what instrument it is, but it's really lovely. Far from our conscious minds, like those fallow fields where open hearts will wander, oh, whispering love, blow through my heart when you can. And the album ends. It's full of pessimism, anxiety and dread, and top-notch vocal performances, interesting arrangements and instrumentation, and beautiful melodies. It's cohesive. If I wanted to be an absolute bastard, I could say that it doesn't jut out in any direction enough. But the question for me isn't that the first solo album by Beth, called Lives Outgrown, lives up to the unbearable weight of expectation. It's whether or not it will be my album of the year. It possibly is so far, and I'm going to give it a 9.5 out of 10.